All right, getting close to wrapping up this chapter. We've got one more section after this one, but this is going to be the last kind of main thing with our quadratics. Chapter 10, section 7, using the discriminant. So the discriminant is a piece of our quadratic formula that we're going to talk specifically about that gives us a lot of information. Okay, so this again is your quadratic formula. So just as a reminder, it's your x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And it tells us the zeros of a function. So whenever we plug in our original equation, we can find where the zeros are, where it crosses the x-axis. Okay, see if it actually does. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. And so that is our quadratic equation. That's our quadratic formula, is solving it, okay, which we talked about in our previous video 10.6. So now we're going to look specifically at the discriminant. Now the discriminant is the part underneath the square root. Now it's not the square root itself, it's the part inside of it. So a discriminant is just b squared minus 4ac. Okay, that is the only part that's called the discriminant. And the discriminant tells us a few things about our parabola. Okay, so the discriminant is just what's underneath the square root. It does not include the square root. Okay, so if you do the calculation underneath and you get 16, your discriminant is 16. It's not 4. Okay, so the discriminant is before you square root it. It's that number. Okay, so here's what the discriminant tells us. If the discriminant equals 0, that means that you only have one real solution. Okay, so if you do the calculation of b squared minus 4ac and you get 0, that means you only have one real solution. Your graph is going to look something like this one over here. Okay, the function ends up touching, or the parabola ends up touching the x-axis, but it doesn't cross over it. Okay, so it just touches it. So like that graph, it touches it at 2, but it doesn't go past it. Okay, it doesn't go into the negative side of the y. The other option is that if you have a b squared minus 4ac is greater than 0, you end up with 2 solutions. The other way of thinking about this is that if the number is positive. So if you do that calculation and you end up with a positive number, you're going to have 2 real solutions. That means that your parabola has dived down below the x-axis and it's turning somewhere below it and it's going to come back up. And so it has to cross at 2 points. Okay. The last option is if you have the b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, okay, which means that it would be negative. Okay, so if you do that calculation and you end up with negative, you have 2 imaginary numbers, okay, or 2 imaginary answers. Now, we're not going to go into detail about imaginary numbers in this class. That's an Algebra II topic that we talk about early in the year. But you have real numbers and imaginary numbers. The imaginary numbers are numbers that fall into the square root of 1 category. So when you take the square, or negative 1, when you take the square root of any negative number, it ends up being imaginary. But when you get a negative for that, you end up getting 2 imaginary numbers, and your parabola will look something like the one to that bottom right, which is either it's going to be all above the x-axis or the whole thing's going to be below the x-axis. So you see it never actually touches the x-axis, which is what we're looking for when we're looking for our solutions. So what the discriminant does is it tells us how many solutions we have and if they're real or imaginary. Okay. So let's say we have this function and we want to find out how many solutions there are. Okay. So what we're going to do is that we're just going to plug it into our b squared minus 4ac and see what we get. 9 squared is 81 minus 4 times 1 times 6, which is 24. So we get 81 minus 24, which gets us a positive 57. So if our answer is a positive 57, does that mean we have 1 real solution, 2 real solutions, or 2 imaginary solutions? That's right, we would end up with 2 real solutions, okay, because it's a positive number. It's greater than 0. So because it's greater than 0, we have 2 real solutions. Okay, so take a second, find the discriminant of this one. Okay, so like the previous problem, the discriminant was 57. Find the discriminant of this problem for it. Okay, so as you've worked through this and you've plugged in your numbers, you should have got 4 squared minus 4 times 3 times 6. You end up with a negative 56. That's your discriminant. So the discriminant's a negative 56. So with this, do we have one real solution, two real solutions, or two imaginary solutions? That's right. Since it's negative, we would end up having two imaginary solutions. Okay, so we have two imaginary solutions with this one. Because we have a negative 56 as our discriminant. Okay, so take a second, find the discriminant of each one of these, and then you also want to state what the how many solutions each one has. Okay, so for the first one, we end up with a discriminant of 97. So the first one ends up with a discriminant of 97. Okay, and the second one we have a discriminant of 0. Okay, so we have a discriminant of 97 for the first and a discriminant of 0 for the second one. Okay, so now the next question is, what is the, how many solutions does the first one have? Right, the first one should have two real solutions because it's a positive. How many solutions should the second one have, the one with the discriminant of 0? Should have only one real solution because the discriminant is 0. So the first one has two solutions, two real solutions. Second one only has one real solution. Okay, so that is the discriminant. So it's helping you identify how many solutions you would have. It doesn't tell you what the zeros are, but it tells you how many you have. Okay, so that's your section 7. That's kind of the end of us dealing with quadratics in this chapter. Work on chapters or section 7 of chapter 10.